Part 2. The War of Attrition. Meanwhile, from bases in Japan, UN weapons and troops poured into Busan. By early September, the UN and South Korean forces had not only consolidated their defensive line, but had also grown stronger and more numerous than the North Korean forces besieging them. The tide of the war was about to turn dramatically. The Allies were ready for a counteroffensive. The daring gambit. The Incheon landing. While his forces were desperately holding on at Busan, General MacArthur devised a bold plan, a gambit that could completely change the course of the war. Instead of launching a direct counterattack from the Busan perimeter, he proposed an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city on the west coast, right next to the capital Seoul and deep behind enemy lines. This plan was vehemently opposed by most other commanders. Incheon was one of the worst possible landing sites in the world. The tides there had an enormous range, nearly 10 meters, creating vast mudflats at low tide. The harbor was surrounded by high seawalls, and the channel leading to it was narrow and treacherous. A landing could only be attempted during a few short hours at high tide. If it failed, the entire landing force would be trapped and annihilated. It was an incredibly risky gamble. But MacArthur, with his ironclad confidence, dismissed all objections. He believed that it was precisely because of these risks that the North Koreans would never expect an attack at Incheon. And he was right. On September 15, 1950, a massive fleet of hundreds of warships appeared off the coast of Incheon. After an intense naval bombardment, 40,000 U.S. troops and 8,600 South Korean troops, along with countless tanks, artillery, and combat vehicles, stormed ashore. The Korean People's Army was taken completely by surprise. They had concentrated the bulk of their forces on the Busan front and had left only a weak defensive force at Incheon. The U.S. forces met with only light resistance. On September 16th, when the North Koreans realized their fatal mistake, they rushed 6 columns of T-34 tanks to counterattack, but it was too late. Under the overwhelming firepower of U.S. tanks and aircraft, this tank formation was quickly destroyed. The Incheon landing was a success beyond imagination. MacArthur swiftly advanced and recaptured Seoul after fierce street fighting. Simultaneously, U.S. forces from the Busan perimeter broke out of the encirclement and began to push north. The entire North Korean army in the south was cut off from its retreat path and caught in a pincer movement. Tens of thousands of soldiers were surrounded and either killed or captured. Of the 70,000 troops around Busan, only about 30,000 managed to escape north in a state of disarray. In just a few weeks, the tide of the war had turned 180 degrees, crossing the 38th parallel and the Dragon's Awakening. The U.S. and Allied forces had completely pushed the North Korean army back across the 38th parallel. The original UN objective of saving the South Korean government had been achieved. In theory, the war could have ended there. But intoxicated by victory, American leaders and General MacArthur became overconfident. They were enticed by the prospect of unifying the entire Korean peninsula under a pro-Western government. Ignoring warnings from China that they would not stand idly by if U.S. troops approached their border, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and advanced into North Korea in early October 1950. The advance was exceptionally smooth. The North Korean army, after its devastating defeat in the south, quickly disintegrated. UN forces captured the capital, Pyongyang, on October 19th. By the end of October, they had neared the Yalu River, the natural border between Korea and China. MacArthur even declared that the war would be over by Christmas. But the UN advance caused extreme alarm in China. The People's Republic of China, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, had only been established a year earlier. They feared that the US and its allies would not stop at the Yalu River, but might extend the war into Chinese territory, directly threatening their national security. In fact, MacArthur and many hawks in the West had publicly stated such intentions. North Korea was now on the brink of collapse. Kim Il-sung repeatedly pleaded with the Soviet Union and China for direct military support. However, Stalin wanted to avoid a direct conflict with the US, so he limited his aid to weapons and equipment, along with limited air support. Soviet pilots flew MiG-15 jets painted with Chinese or North Korean insignia, and were only allowed to operate within 100 kilometers of the front. Finally, China decided to act. Mao Zedong made a historic decision: to send volunteers to Korea to resist America, aid Korea, and defend the homeland. On October 19, 1950, the same day UN forces captured Pyongyang, hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the Chinese People's Volunteer Army secretly crossed the Yalu River into Korea. They moved mainly at night, through rugged mountains, to avoid detection by US air reconnaissance. On October 25th, 270,000 Chinese troops suddenly confronted the US Army. The UN forces were completely shocked. They could not have anticipated that such a massive force could appear so suddenly out of nowhere. A series of human wave attacks by the Chinese army pushed the American forces south of the Chongchon River. By November 7th, 4 more Chinese armies had entered Korea, increasing their total strength to 380,000 soldiers, creating a decisive numerical superiority over the 220,000 UN troops. In late November, General Peng Dehuai, commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers, launched a full-scale counteroffensive across the entire front. Despite being vastly inferior in firepower, with no tanks and virtually no air support, the Chinese army, with its courageous fighting spirit, iron discipline, and sound tactics, encirclement, division, and night attacks, won a resounding victory. US forces, particularly the 1st Marine Division surrounded at the Chosin Reservoir, had to endure a hellish retreat in the bone-chilling cold of the Korean winter. They were forced to flee south, forming a defensive perimeter around the port city of Hungnam. Facing the threat of complete annihilation, a massive evacuation was carried out. In December, 1939 ships transported over 100,000 military personnel and 90,000 Korean civilian refugees from Hungnam to the safety of Busan. By the end of 1950, MacArthur's dream of unification was shattered. Chinese and North Korean forces had reclaimed all territory north of the 38th parallel. The war was back to its starting point, but on a much larger and more brutal scale. Stalemate, attrition, and negotiations. In January 1951, the combined Chinese-North Korean forces continued their offensive. UN forces could not withstand the onslaught and had to retreat rapidly southward. Seoul was once again abandoned and captured on January 4, 1951. It was the 3rd time the city had changed hands in less than a year. UN forces continued to retreat until they established a new defensive line south of Seoul. However, the Chinese forces had also reached their limit. They had advanced too far from their supply lines, lacking motorized transport and constantly threatened by US air power. All of China's food and ammunition had to be crudely transported at night by foot or bicycle from the Yalu River, hundreds of kilometers from the front. This supply method could not meet the needs of a massive army. China was forced to halt its offensive and switch to a defensive posture. General Matthew Ridgway, who replaced General Walton Walker, killed in a vehicle accident, restored the morale of the UN forces. In late January, Seeing that the enemy's front lines had weakened, he launched a full-scale counteroffensive, making full use of the UN's overwhelming firepower on the ground and in the air. In early February, UN forces reached the Han River and recaptured the outskirts of Seoul. In March, they fully retook the capital. It was the fourth and final time the city changed hands during the war. UN forces continued to advance until they reached a new line, known as the Kansas-Wyoming Line, located some distance north of the 38th parallel. In April and May 1951, China launched two massive spring offensives involving 700,000 troops, a final attempt to achieve a decisive victory. But this time, the UN forces had learned how to counter them. Their tenacious resistance in battles at the Incheon River and Kapyong stopped the Chinese army in its tracks. After failed offensives and heavy losses, both sides realized that neither could achieve an absolute military victory. The UN's decision to halt at the Kansas line and not continue large-scale offensive operations into North Korea pushed the war into a stalemate. The remainder of the war, which dragged on for another 2 years, was a bloody sequence of trench warfare and attrition. The two sides fought over every hill and every inch of ground in battles that were strategically meaningless, but caused horrific casualties, such as the battles for Pork Chop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge. The skies over North Korea were relentlessly pounded by US Air Force bombings, which leveled its cities. Meanwhile, long and difficult peace negotiations began on July 10, 1951 at Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom. The most contentious issue was the repatriation of prisoners of war. The UN side insisted on voluntary repatriation, meaning Chinese and North Korean POWs could choose not to return home, while the Chinese and North Koreans demanded the repatriation of all prisoners. This deadlock prolonged the war for many more months and cost thousands more lives. In November 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected U.S. president, partly on his promise to end the war in Korea. After taking office, he visited Korea and increased both military and diplomatic pressure to find a solution. The death of Stalin in March 1953 also contributed to a shift in the communist side's position. Finally, after 2 years and 17 days of negotiations involving 575 meetings, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. Legacy of the war, a scar that hasn't healed. The armistice ended the fighting, but it did not bring true peace. Technically, the two Koreas are still at war. The front line at the time of the ceasefire became the new dividing line, and a 4-kilometer-wide, 250-kilometer-long demilitarized zone, DMZ, was established along it, becoming the most heavily fortified border in the world. The war left behind a horrific legacy. Nearly 3 million Koreans, both military and civilian, were killed. Millions more lost their homes, and the entire peninsula was devastated. China lost an estimated 180,000 to 400,000 soldiers. Figures are disputed. The UN side, primarily the US, also suffered losses, with over 36,000 American soldiers killed and more than 100,000 wounded. The war cemented the permanent division of the Korean peninsula. The North followed an isolated socialist path, while the South, with American aid, developed into a dynamic capitalist economy. Millions of families remained separated, with no way to contact their relatives on the other side of the border. For decades, the DMZ remained a symbol of Cold War tension and confrontation. It was not until April 2018, during a historic summit, that the leaders of the two Koreas issued a joint declaration, formally ending the state of war and committing to finding a way to unify in peace. Nevertheless, the Korean War, often called the Forgotten War, remains a tragic chapter in human history, a painful reminder of the consequences of ideological division, the interference of great powers, and the unending sorrow of a nation forced to point guns at its own brethren. The scar it left on the Korean peninsula and in the hearts of its people is still there, a scar that has never truly healed. Thanks for watching.